Oh, desk is back in its original position, up against the wall. I thought this might work better for the summer light that comes in from these. You don't care, do you? I'll just crack on with the video. Okay, so in my last video I spent about 7 minutes talking about how small sensors, I don't know what I mean by that, that's not a small sensor size, how small sensors are really incredible in modern cameras. And I was basically saying that if you bought a modern camera that had a small sensor, you'd be blown away by the output that it produced. And then I ended the video by saying that, well, I said I still use a big, heavy, full frame Nikon. But I think I mentioned that I still use this, not because it's full frame, but because it has excellent dynamic range. Now, it's a fairly common misconception that all full frame cameras have great dynamic range. It's not strictly true. The sensors in the modern Nikons are very well known for having good dynamic range. Canon, not so much. But that Nikon is very good. So for those of you who don't know, this video answers the question, what the hell is dynamic range? Well, you know when you walk up to a big wall and you think, that'd be a nice picture. Okay, just stick with me on this one. And you get your camera out and you think, this will be a lovely image. And you hope that the image you get will look like what you see with your eyes in front of you, which is something like this. Problem is, in reality, you take the picture and it looks something like this. And you look at your camera screen and you say something along the lines of, what the... So why does this happen? Well, in short, your camera can't see as many tones as your eyes can. The human eye is incredible, and camera sensors aren't quite matching it yet, which is well, is fair enough, I think. So what the camera does is it picks one area of the image and meters for that area to try and replicate accurate tones for just that part of the image. So in that instance, it's trying to meter just for the sky, which means that the wall is really, really underexposed. There are a few popular techniques to try and avoid this. Number one, use a graduated filter. Now, if you've never seen a graduated filter, it looks like you'd expect. It has a graduated, what would be the word? Shading? Now, it's designed to give the whole image a correct exposure, even when it's a really high contrast image. So typically in this scenario, what you'd do is you would place the dark area of the filter over the sky, and then you would expose for the wall. And what that would mean is you get the right exposure for the wall, and the filter stops the detail in the sky blowing out. Now, in the instance I showed you, that doesn't particularly matter because there's no clouds, no detail in the sky, but if there were clouds, you'd end up blowing the highlights without a filter. Method number two, HDR. Now, you've probably heard of HDR. There's a HDR function on the iPhone, there's a HDR function on most modern cameras, Lightroom has a HDR tool, and there's loads of dedicated software for HDR. HDR stands for High Dynamic Range, which is a term that's been adopted by the technique of taking multiple exposures and blending them together using tone mapping or some other algorithm to boost the tonality of a shot. Boost the tonality? Is tonality a word? To increase the number of tones in a shot. Now, HDR can produce some great images. It can also look a little bit unnatural. So to fix that, there's option number three, which is taking those same multiple exposures and blending them yourself in Photoshop using luminosity masks, or the apply image tool, or even just layer mask. Now, that's another video, but when you're doing those things yourself in Photoshop, you have much more control over using some HDR software that's got its own algorithm. You can choose how much you want to blend and what areas of the image you want to blend most, and yeah, much more flexible method. But the problem with all those options is they take time. If you use a graduated filter, obviously you've got to take that filter with you, you've got to make sure it's clean, you've got to put it in front of your lens, you've got to make sure you've got the right exposure. If you haven't, you've got to remove it and use another one instead. It's a bit of a time-consuming process, and if you're shooting something that's moving or it's going to vanish in a matter of seconds or minutes, it's not really the right option. As for HDR and luminosity masks, when you're collecting multiple exposures, obviously that doesn't really take much time. You can do it in a second if you're bracketing. But if you've got a subject that's moving, a tree in the wind, a bus driving past, someone walking, then you'll end up with ghosting because you can't take all those exposures at exactly the same time. Now, HDR software is okay generally at getting rid of those ghosts from multiple exposures, but typically speaking, your image can get a bit messy if you're shooting for HDR but you've got stuff moving in the frame. Obviously there is a way around this, and you guessed it, you use a camera with high dynamic range. Sorry, I'm not going to call it high dynamic range. Good dynamic range. Like the Nikon. Now, to demonstrate the dynamic range of this camera, I pitted it against the camera that I'm filming with right now, which is the Lumix G80. A camera that I would use basically full time if it wasn't for this dynamic range issue. Right, so here's the deal. Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the world's simplest test. What I've got here is two files, one from the Nikon and one from the Lumix. As you can see, they're both horridly underexposed, so all I'm going to do to both of them is raise the exposure by 5 stops, and what that will give us is a much better exposure for the wall. If I make sure they're both selected and then I press C, what we can do is compare them. So on the left, what you've got now is the Nikon file, and on the right you've got the Lumix file. Now, I don't know if you can see much of a difference on your screens, but if I zoom in, I'm pretty sure you will see a difference. So this Nikon file on the left, I would deem to be perfectly usable. There's an acceptable level of noise, it's still nice and sharp, there's bags of detail, but if I go onto the Lumix image on the right, it's missing a fair amount of detail, it's just full of noise. It's not particularly sharp, it's grainy, it's dingy, the colour is just nasty. I wouldn't use this shot. Now don't get me wrong, the Lumix did a whole lot better than I expected it to, and if I hadn't pushed it quite this far, maybe only 2 or 3 stops, I may have been perfectly happy with the result. But as you can see, the Nikon is just in a different league and gives me so much more flexibility when it comes to pulling files apart and matching exposures. Now I can hear what you're saying, James, that's a ridiculous extreme example. And do you know what? You're right. I've never underexposed by 5 stops. Maybe a couple of times. But there are 2 reasons why the Nikon's ability to do this over this is important to me. Number 1 is that with a Nikon sensor I can just expose for the sky. And when I expose for the sky, everything that's darker than the sky will probably be underexposed, but I can always just drag up the shadows in post, which effectively means I can produce an image that's as effective as HDR, but with just 1 exposure. And the second and more important one is that because I spend a lot of time compositing and stitching images together, it's important that the exposures of all those images match, otherwise the image won't look realistic. So when I shoot with that Nikon, I know that if I don't get the exposures exactly matched when I'm in the field, then when I get into Photoshop I can boost and lower the exposures of each image to make sure that they can match, and in the process I won't introduce any noise and I won't lose any detail. And both of those things help make my images look much more real. I think anyway. You might not. Check out my Instagram. Sneaky little plug. Ooh, another thing, the place I shot these images is just behind a reservoir, and I'll be going back there in hopefully a day or 2 to film a vlog and get some images for 2 or 3 concepts. I'm just waiting for an overcast day, which you wouldn't have thought you'd have to wait that long for, being in the UK, but we're on to day 5 of no clouds. So, I mean, I'm not one to moan, but I'm assuming that if you're watching this, you enjoy photography, and if you do enjoy photography, you'll sympathise with me wanting worse weather. Just a couple of clouds, you know? I'm not asking for much. And then when I got my shots, they can go away again, and, you know, we're good for another week. But until then, thank you for watching.